Video. Before we get to the new update on GTA, we gotta watch this video. Why did PS2 look so cool? I love the PS. I love the PS2. The aesthetics, the commercials, the console itself, the games that came with it. It was so good. Good time. Good time.
Do you feel a strange connection to these graphics? What about these locations? Despite being over 2 decades old, there's something about these visuals that people are still so obsessed with, to the point that many developers will choose them over modern graphics. Whether it's the charm of low poly textures or the fact that half the games were set on refreshing tropical islands, I want to find out what made the PS2 aesthetic so iconic. And also, so weird.
God damn.
But first, what exactly is the PS2 aesthetic? I'm sure you've seen videos of people using AI to recreate the look. They end up with an image that looks fresh out of Bully or Deus Ex. But the aesthetic is a lot more than just a filter. The graphics, the lighting, the atmosphere, it's all distinct. In fact, some of the effects were outright impossible to emulate on later consoles. For instance, in Gran Turismo 3 for the PS2, the asphalt had this really cool heat haze effect that made the tracks feel way more real. But when the PS3 came around, the developers found it was completely incapable of recreating it, despite being way more powerful on paper. And that's ignoring the original Xbox, which, while being roughly 3 times more powerful than the PS2, struggled to pack the effects of the exact same titles into a smooth 30 FPS. In games like Metal Gear Solid 2, the rain would slow it to a crawl, while the smaller console barely stuttered. The thing is, Sony had a trick up their sleeve, something that allowed them to create groundbreaking weather conditions and atmosphere that, frankly, embarrassed much stronger consoles. When the PS2 was being developed in the late 90s, they knew they wanted more from their games. More animation, more immersion, and naturally, more emotion. They didn't just want the characters to feel more alive though. Everything from the environments to the gameplay needed to be more intense and cinematic. They achieved this by creating the Emotion Engine, a cluster of processors built to help generate particles and simulate cloth, rain, wind, and water at abnormal speeds. But with great power comes PS2 Hagrid.
Yeah.
The gymnastics they had to do to make this engine even function came at a cost. A lot of the PS2 aesthetic revolves around this hazy, almost dreamlike filter that was layered over every game. It wasn't really an intentional choice though. It was a necessary trade-off for the engine's advanced effects and smoother gameplay. It just so happens to create an instantly recognizable style. Lights and faces have this unique, soft glow to them. On a technical level, this was often the result of games using vertex lighting. It calculates the light at the corners of a model and then blends it across the surface. It was simply cheaper and easier than doing the same for each individual pixel, which would have been the alternative. The consequence though is this blurred, softer look. The hardware was also responsible for the reliance on fog, another hallmark of the aesthetic. Silent Hill, Shadow...
I love the fog in the games. The games, like back in the day in PS2, the fog and the rain used to look so good, and like hearing it will feel like you outside. Now it does feel like that now, but like in a different way, you know. It don't feel that joy and stuff. It actually feel like you're outside in the dark, like, you know.
Of the Colossus, their fog isn't just hiding distant terrain, it's building atmosphere. Environments like forests feel so much more mystical. It begs you to keep exploring, slowly unveiling your surroundings instead of showing you everything at once. In Silent Hill, it was even more deliberate. By the second game, the fog had become an essential component of the art style and story. The PS2's Emotion Engine allowed it to be heavier and deeply claustrophobic. Still, these effects and filters aren't the only explanations for the aesthetic's popularity. There's just something so special about low poly graphics. And I know I'm not the only person who thinks this. It's become a whole niche today for graphic designers, with thousands of people intentionally using it in their artwork. In concept, it's pretty simple. Modern titles have more polygons, older titles have less. If you're looking at a bunch of chunky, flat surfaces, it's low poly. And if you're on the PlayStation 2, that's polygonna be most of the games. Obviously not to the same extent as the PS1, but still at a point where you can count the number of rectangles used for Big Smoke's fingers. Chances are though, you remember these games as being just as immersive as the ray-traced, hyper-realistic worlds we get now. And personally, I'd say this isn't simply nostalgia or your imagination. Low poly trades detail for clarity. There isn't as much clutter and complex textures filling up environments. Your brain can immediately process and get a clearer picture of the objects, terrain, and enemies around you. And for the stuff that isn't there, you just use your imagination engine, the same one you use when you read a book or close your eyes. Many argue that this creates a more engaging experience because low poly graphics encourage you to fill in the gaps yourself. Kind of like how fog creates a constant sense of mystery. Until you've explored, you can only imagine what it's hiding. In both cases, it's what the game doesn't show you that makes you feel connected and intrigued. And that mysterious aura is exactly why people are so invested in the aesthetic. But it's still not the full picture. Because if you recognize most of the games so far, you might also remember a period from the late 90s to the early 2000s when studios were obsessed with tropical islands. I've touched on this phenomenon before, but I completely forgot just how popular it was on the PS2. Almost all of the games people reference were either on it or the GameCube. While Nintendo had Super Mario Sunshine and The Wind Waker, the PS2 had Final Fantasy X, Kingdom Hearts, Jak and Daxter, and Crash Twinsanity. All of these games either took place in tropical settings or made sure to at least visit them, and I get it because they're just so nice to look at. I love the look of their low poly palm trees, endless horizons, and the soft pink gradients they'd paint across the sky at sunset. Again, I really don't think these locations would hit the same with modern graphics. The bright and chunky visuals create this really satisfying contrast between the sand, the trees, and the ocean. If they were made today, the colors would be toned down and everything would look more muted and realistic. You lose half the charm that made these tropical locations so inviting. Of course, this fixation spread far beyond PlayStation. I mentioned the GameCube, but you'd also find it on the original Xbox and the Dreamcast. Sonic Adventure's Emerald Coast is possibly the cleanest example of the style. This brings up a question though, one that you're probably already asking. Why? Why did every studio randomly become infatuated with islands and the tropics? Well, for starters, it was easy. To make a tropical island, you really only need a couple trees and rocks. This requires way less processing power than something like a city. At a time when so many games were new to 3D, they often picked from the same handful of biomes for this very reason. So you saw a lot of deserts, snow levels, and tropical islands. With such uniform colors, developers could get away with using fewer textures and less detail. The end product would look good either way. That being said, the explanation does go a little deeper. In the early 2000s, advanced reflections, volumetric sunlight, and bloom were seen as markers of the next generation. And what better way to showcase these than a tropical island? I mean, water suddenly went from being a flat blue plain to a graphical milestone. Waves, whirlpools, wind, it was the perfect setting. Looking back, a lot of these titles still hold up. Besides, shorelines and lagoons remain gorgeous. And imagine drinking the Super Mario Sunshine water at 3 AM. The reasons weren't all technical though. Many developers were directly inspired by places in Japan and Hawaii. For Japanese studios, it was often born of nostalgia for the country's subtropical islands. Regions like Okinawa. As part of the Ryukyu archipelago, Okinawa is packed with lush forests and bright blue waters. The lead writer for Final Fantasy X credits these very environments as the inspiration for Spira. Southeast Asia played a role too, particularly the foliage and architecture found in Thailand. Anyway, while I do miss this tropical period, it wasn't really the most memorable part of the PS2 aesthetic. In fact, most of its games had a completely different tone, one that defined what was arguably the darkest and edgiest period in gaming history.
I like it though. I like it though. I liked it though. You can't be mad. Yeah, it was weird. People had, it had like that creepy aesthetic to it and all that jazz, but after all that, it just looks so swaggy, bro. If you don't know taste, you don't know taste all like that, bro. You don't know taste all like that. I remember the baby commercial, the baby PS2 commercial. That shit was low-key lit. I fuck with that heavy. The art, the darkness of it, that shit was just gas to me when I was younger. Not gonna lie. Not for the 50.
There's something about horror games from this era that people find distinctly unsettling. So much so that they've carved out their own space decades later, inspiring hundreds of indie games and artists. For example, you may have heard of PSX horror. It describes the look and feel of survival horror games for the PS1. Characterized by crunchy, pixelated textures, low poly models and jagged edges, it's basically what you'd find in Silent Hill and early Resident Evil titles. A lot of their darker atmosphere came from technical limitations, and the same can be said for their sequels on the PS2. Mostly. You see, things started to change in the early 2000s. Suddenly, it was no longer enough to just be scary. Consumers wanted something grittier, something even darker. And so began the golden age of the PS2. Series that started off as family-friendly platformers were stripped of their innocence and given weapons and apocalyptic cover art. This was happening everywhere, but the PlayStation 2 was absolutely the epicenter. Even the tamest, most mediocre release would be wrapped in this epic, over-the-top aesthetic. Blood, explosions, metal. As we've established, it wasn't exclusive to horror games, but it was there that it really shined. They made an effort to explore darker, more provocative themes, paired with chaotic graphic styles. It was this edginess that led to more than a few titles being outright banned, censored, or restricted in certain countries. Games like Rule of Rose and Manhunt. But that's beside the point. What I'm more interested in is why these games are still so creepy despite their technically worse graphics. They're so effective, in fact, that developers choose them today over modern engines. Luckily, the answer is hidden in a single game. Armed with nothing but a camera, Fatal Frame places you inside Himuro Mansion, an abandoned Japanese estate deep within the forest. The found footage style intro reveals that you're searching for your brother, who went missing there weeks ago. But as you venture deeper and deeper within, you realize that Himuro Mansion is far from abandoned. The game offers a masterclass in transforming graphical limitations into psychological horror. Textures have jagged edges that shift and shimmer with every step. There's a grainy filter that intensifies in moments of danger. These are both markers of low fidelity visuals, but here they add to the game's unsettling qualities. Everything looks distorted, unnatural. It's also just really dark. Even with a torch, there's places you can't fully light up. This and its relatively low draw distance makes enemies terrifying. They just emerge out of the darkness or blend in until you're far too close. The result is some uniquely disturbing scenarios. At one point, you run into an unidentifiable blob of flesh rolling around the floor. When you photograph it, the game simply reads, "female head." Even smaller details, like characters' faces, are significantly more uncanny in this style. The entity's expressions are rigid and difficult to read, and oftentimes you can only make out a few disturbing details. A mouth, a pair of eyes. You can find these kinds of elements in pretty much every PS2 survival horror game. They share an aesthetic that worked because the graphics kind of didn't. But if we're calling games like Fatal Frame disturbing and unhinged, where do you find the words to describe this? Honestly, I had no idea where to even begin. Until I had some gamer subs. This tastes like the Super Mario Sun.
W ad, but crazy ass ad, bro.
Sunshine Water looks with.
That shit is a crazy ass ad. Y'all saw it?
To get 10% off everything, click the link below or simply use code MINT. In the 90s and 2000s, ads were comfortable with getting a little freaky. Alright, maybe more than a little freaky. Nintendo ran a whole campaign for the DS centered around phrases like "touching is good" and "you can touch me down there if you want to." For whatever reason, they slapped this message onto everything. Imagine walking around with a shirt saying, "I was touched by the Nintendo DS." Kind of like the regional variants in Pokemon, they even made different versions for different locations. This one proudly reads, "I got touched at Panama City Beach." When it's that specific, it kind of stops being funny. Anyway, Nintendo weren't the only ones doing this, and Sony's were even more traumatizing. Their mental wealth advert for the PS2 featured a woman with a warped, alien-like skull. There's no context, no gameplay, and no mention of the console. Instead, she speaks vaguely about human potential, expanding our limits and our minds. Naturally, it was all very intentional. In the director's seat was Chris Cunningham, known for his work with Aphex Twin. The ad was made to be surreal and disturbing. The message isn't, here's a cool game box for your kids. It's, this console is the future and the future is weird. This trend continued with a mock ad for the PlayStation 9. The console is essentially just a drug contained within a glass sphere. When opened, it releases spores that shoot up your nose and anchor themselves to your adrenal gland. At the end of the ad, they finally show the logo for the PS2, alongside the words, the beginning.
Ooh.
It's saying that buying a PlayStation 2 is like buying your own little piece of the future. Still, it's a little harder to decipher their print ads. An eye with the 4 symbols etched in blood, a headless body shopping for heads. Some are cool, while others are simply disturbing. Another shows a man with a series of molds, preparing to shape faces made of clay. Imagine being the poor fucker that gets squished into Homer Simpson. Again, these were supposed to make you uncomfortable. They wanted the PS2 to feel otherworldly and powerful. And when people finally got their hands on it, it lived up to those expectations. Because it didn't just feel like the future, it looked like it. Booting up a PlayStation 2 for the first time is a memory that's hard to forget. A chime rings out as an ethereal pad swells in the background, creating a serene and futuristic ambience. The only time it didn't hit was when it played at 12 AM on a school night, but just as iconic as the startup sound were the visuals. The background features a collection of silver pillars rising through a blue haze. As you play, these increase in number, each representing a new game. The rest of the UI is relatively simple, but it still feels advanced, with abstract 3D elements and a clean black and blue color scheme. And it wasn't just the interface. The console itself had a bunch of futuristic variants and colorways. My favorite has always been the translucent ocean blue model. Released exclusively in Japan, it commemorated the sale of 10 million consoles. Both the controller and case are see-through, so you can look at everything that's going on inside. I've said it before and I'll say it again, Cleartech needs to come back. Yeah. That being said, even the plain silver version was iconic. It's so sleek.
Xbox
now, none of this was random. The UI, the marketing, the aesthetic. It was all part of a cohesive vision, a vision with a very clear purpose. On paper, the PS2 wasn't the most powerful, it wasn't even the most affordable, but none of that mattered. The PS2 outsold all of its competitors combined by a factor of 3. With over 160 million units sold, it remains the most popular console of all time. Why? Because it was more than just a console. Sony was selling an idea that by purchasing a PlayStation 2, you were buying the console of the future. And in many ways, you were. They did everything they could to cram in groundbreaking effects, stunning and a library of games that's yet to be rivaled. With all of this in mind, it's no surprise that the PS2 aesthetic became legendary. If you enjoyed this video and want me to cover your favorite console next, let me know and subscribe so you don't miss it. This has been Extra Man.
That's what PlayStation need to do. They need to like redo the PS2 how they did for like the 30th anniversary or how many anniversaries it was for the original PlayStation. They need to do that and make it more like powerful or some shit. Oh my gosh. Because so much potential that PS2 has, and with games like Puppet Combo now, they could really add Puppet Combo games or ask the developers to make games like Puppet Combo. Like not horror, but things like adventure games, racing games that we played back in the day. But they can literally ask them to just make those type of games again. Like, if they really wanted to, but, you know, Sony is, like, pushing the future overboard a little bit now with the PS5 and shit. But, you know, I like it, though. I like it.